Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha. In this episode, I'll be discussing Through a Lens Darkly. Through a Lens Darkly is a 2014 documentary directed by Thomas Allen Harris about the history of Black people in America, both in front and behind the lens. The film explores how the camera has been used at various times to shape the public image of Black America. Beginning during slavery and ending in the recent past, the documentary presents and discusses photos of Black people from through the decades, but also presents short profiles of notable Black photographers. The documentary begins with a key memory from the filmmaker's past. So here we have the discussion of the history of the Black image, specifically through photography and as part of that film. The narrator explains that when he was a child, one day he put Vaseline or something like that on his face and it left his skin looking very greasy. His father yelled at him about it, roughly wiping it off, telling him that if he went out into the street like that, people are going to think that he looks like a greasy monkey. And it so happened that on this day, his father also left the family. So he uses that as a jumping off point for discussing the film, right, and the history of the Black image as told by mainstream white media and society versus the image and perception of Black people through photography as told by Black people. The stark difference in how Black people are presented and have been presented throughout history based on who's taking the pictures. People probably began taking photographs in like the 1800s, but back then, because it wasn't like now where people have smartphones, a camera in their pocket pretty much, back then, people went to photographers to have their picture taken. It was relatively expensive, so it was a luxury. It was something that people dressed up for. It was to mark momentous occasions or just to keep a history of the family. This was still during the period of slavery, so Black people typically didn't have the means to take their own pictures back then, or at least very few did. Early on, the image of Black people, it's kind of a reflection of white people that are taking their pictures. And many of those instances, they'd actually be either slaveholders or part of that slave structure. But as time progressed, and especially following the Civil War, when Black people began to gain in some larger numbers, were now free, and at least theoretically, many were now achieving some degree of progress and financial success, or at least stability. They were now in a position where they could afford, or at least they could save up to hire a photographer or to visit a photography studio to have images of them and their loved ones taken. We have this thing of art imitating life in a way. We're charting the course of history, and as Black people became more independent and financially stable in comparison to what they once were, they were able to help craft their own self-image. And so it still exists to this day, these stereotypical images that are being used to tell stories about Black people. They often have ulterior motives. As time goes on, Black people are able to either hire photographers, and so we see Black people beginning to understand, recognizing through seeing these stereotypical images, the power of photography. And not just that, the opportunity to be had by controlling the Black image. I've stated before on my channel that I'm a huge fan of photography. As an elective, I took a photography class in college. I'd always been curious about photography, but up to that point, I'd never had a camera of my own, not like a really good camera. Older family members like my mom and those types of people, they had cameras, but cameras were relatively expensive, and these weren't professional cameras. It was more just, it was sort of something that you used for special occasions that you wanted to record. To think of it as a kid, I remember my mom dressing me up even for like basic things like going to school. If we had a few extra minutes in the morning, once I was dressed and we were ready to go out the door, she'd be like, okay, like pose, and she'd just snap a quick picture. I actually have quite a few photographs from when I was a kid, but it was this thing of like the adults using the camera, not the kids. The camera was viewed as like a valuable and fragile possession. I remember being a kid and my mom and other family members having like photo albums. My mom had an album that was like filled with pictures of me as a baby, a toddler, around preschool. And you also had school pictures, right? So your mom would keep like the bigger ones, but they would get packages with smaller pictures, and those would be given to aunts, uncles, grandparents. And so by the time you got to adulthood, there's like this huge collection, sort of like an archive of images of you at various points in your early life. Unfortunately, my family has what we call picture thieves. People that when they come over to your house, you've got to keep an eye on them because you might have like a really nice photo, especially if it's like an older family member where either there aren't that many pictures of them, they might have passed away or something, or it's just like a rare picture. And they would just take them, which is actually really selfish, but that's a conversation for another day. Living in New York, Every year we'd go to like the car show. You have the USS Intrepid, which is like the Naval Museum, other little places, little events and places like that where we would typically visit during the summer. Maybe not every summer, but every so often. And so in attending these events, you might take along your camera, right? Recording these places that you visited, taking pictures of yourself, that you've experienced it, that you've been here and whatnot. And so with that, you end up with a collection of pictures from moments in your life. Everyday things, birthdays, holidays, but also places you visited. And I remember visiting Germany as part of a program for my school. And I think that was like my first camera. It wasn't anything fancy. You couldn't do much of anything, but I had my own. And so it becomes this thing where, especially within my family, we would have gatherings. So like Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner, or just random meetings. My mom and her siblings would end up talking about little funny stories from their childhood. And so with that, you would take out these pictures and look back through them, especially when my grandmother was alive. Even my grandfather, we would look back through these pictures and you'd see older relatives who might have passed away like in the time since. And so it would be this thing of like you as a kid, older relatives telling you through pictures about people that maybe either, they passed away before you were born or when you were very young and so you didn't have an opportunity to get to know them. They would explain to you with these pictures, telling you like the person's name, how you're related, or, if they were just a family acquaintance, and they would share like memories that they had with them. So certainly you had that oral history, but it added something to be able to look at a picture and put an image, to put a face with the name, to put a face with the stories. Since that college photography class, I've always had some kind of a camera. After I graduated from college, I bought a DSLR, and I had that for several years where I just shot photos. And I had that up until like 2010, right? I then had my camera phone at some point along the way, and I got very into photography. So like going on photo walks, taking pictures of places, scenes, people. I upgraded my camera a few years ago, and since then I've gotten into YouTube and whatnot. And so it's like now it's more video than photos, but still this thing of capturing images. So that's my personal story. But when I heard about this documentary, I thought it'd be pretty interesting to check it out because it seemed to combine two of my interests, what would be photography and then the history of Black people. In that regard, when you settle in to watch the documentary, the photographs that are featured are absolutely amazing because it's like, with other aspects of Black history, where you have these images and people that are often referred to, there's like a vast expanse of Black people and the Black experience. And with that, Black images beyond the small group that's like typically shared. You see some unseen photos here or some rare photos. Over the years, especially in doing Black history shorts and whatnot, I use Google quite often to find images of the subject that I'm describing. So for like backdrops, promotional images and whatnot. But as part of that, sometimes you come across these really great photos. Or for people that were around, like, let's say back in the 1700s, 1800s, there are either no pictures of them. It's difficult to find pictures, or it might just be like, one or two. But for like musicians, actors, actresses from like the 1900s, especially the 60s and onwards, you find a wider array of them, right? More images are readily available. And, you also have images of everyday Black people. A few months ago, I was watching Many Rivers to Cross. So it's a documentary that charts the history of Black people in America. And looking at that, I was amazed. Like, I've seen a few select photos of people that had been enslaved, but it's like the same photos that you typically see. There's like the picture of the guy with the lash marks in his back, a few other people, but it's just like this handful of photos that you see frequently. But in watching that documentary during the period when they were discussing slavery, in the years after seeing that, there was like a far wider array of pictures, right? Like through the years, images of Black people in like the 1920s and to the 1940s, but also Reconstruction, just everyday people going about their lives, like really beautiful and priceless photos. To find this documentary about the Black image where it's, sure, you have like the typical narration. You have famous Black photographers and stuff like that, present photographers describing how they came into photography, the history of photography. And as the underlying thing, the most powerful image is actually these various pictures and photos. Just the image of Black people through the decades, this really great collection of photographs. The filmmaker features a lot of pictures from his own family, where his grandfather had been the family photographer. And he discusses how within many families, you have that person that always has the camera, that takes pictures at family gatherings. I think within my family, I'm probably that person, or at least one of those people. And so he shows these photographs from his own family's legacy, from his family history. And what I thought was pretty interesting, it was actually pretty cool, is that his grandfather was the family photographer. So you had him taking pictures throughout his life, right? And then him taking pictures of his kids, his grandkids, which includes the filmmaker. His grandfather gave him and his brother their first cameras when they were children. And with that, he then becomes a photographer and a filmmaker. So it's kind of like this thing of his grandfather handing down his legacy. And you see this family through the ages. You see people taking pictures of him and his grandfather taking pictures of him, and then him taking pictures of other people. And so this is reflected within other families, but it's especially interesting and compelling within the Black community because of this history of the negative portrayals of the Black image, the negative manipulation of the Black image. So here you kind of have this telling of the development where things started with regards to the Black image as the rest of Black lives for so many people being controlled by the racist power structure on down to the present where there's still some of that, but it feels like at least you get more voice from Black people as they begin to take greater control of their image. As we move through the ages and Black people achieve greater freedom, they now start to take their own pictures and photographs, and with that to tell their own stories, to craft their own self-image, to depict themselves and present themselves with the public through their own eyes. And so there are examples of these different series throughout the history of Black photography. And when I say Black photography, I mean both Black people as the subjects and then also Black people as the photographers. So there's discussion of daguerreotype and the free Black man that was exposed to daguerreotype in France, him bringing it back to Louisiana and the development of that style of photography being used by other photographers such as J.P. Ball, who was, just a quick fun fact, the grandfather of Alice Ball, who would become a noted chemist. Of particular note is that this is like one of the earliest instances of Black people taking pictures of other Black people. In this case, it was him taking pictures of his family members. And so it moves on to this collaboration between a white man and a Black guy on a series of photographs about these families of people that had been enslaved. And so from this series comes a few photographs that I'm sure you're familiar with. Like I recognize some of them. There's one photograph of this woman that I don't think I've previously seen. So she has like really nice smooth skin. She's looking straight forward and there's just kind of this unsettling feel to her eyes. I used to think that like people back in the olden days were very serious, like mean and stern, because when you see photographs of them, they never smile. They're always very serious. Until I started reading more books about history and learn more about photography, like the everyday lives of people from back in history, and realized that no, they were human beings just like us. It's just that cameras had long shutter times. So a person would have to pose and hold that for the photograph to be captured. And so it was uncomfortable or almost impossible for a person to sit there and hold a smile for that long period. So people would just, with a straight face, sit down and the photograph would be taken. I immediately recognized the picture of the woman, right? I just never knew the backstory of it, but they gave some context, right? That there's this collection of photographs taken from during slavery. And it's noted that at the time, a Black person who was enslaved would not be allowed to look their owner directly in the eye, or really any other white person in the eye. But here it is that you have this collection of photographs where they're staring dead on into the camera. Their faces are devoid of emotion, so you can't really tell their thoughts, but the eyes are very striking. He then moves on to this next series of photographs that would have been taken during slavery, where you have enslaved people, primarily women, in pictures with the white children that they care for. And it's kind of weird in a sense because we know that these people are enslaved. These aren't jobs that they've chosen for themselves. And so here they are in photos and pictures with the offspring of the people who will likely own them in these somewhat tender poses, which is kind of like propaganda. It plays into this idea of slaves being happy in their position, this falsehood of them being a member of the family. These people hold you in bondage, but you're holding the baby, like cuddling or cradling the child. So the enslaved still would not have been paying for these pictures at that time, right? The pictures would have been commissioned by their owners. And so that gives you some insight into how these photographs came about. And as far as who most likely chose the pose and positioning. Within that framework, you have the emergence of these Black abolitionist figures and them understanding the importance of controlling their self-image. Maybe like, with the development of technology, greater availability of funds, and more likely just Black people moving towards freedom, it's noted that Sojourner Truth would have likely been the first Black person, or at least Black woman, to really take control of her image. So I've seen a few pictures of her. I did a profile about her and found like a few photographs, but they mostly seem to be variations on the same kind of image. It looks like these were like packaged and sold as a way of bringing some kind of attention to the abolitionist cause and, the various things she was involved with. And this was also the case with Frederick Douglass. In doing a profile about him, I found a few more pictures. The ones that I'd been most familiar with as a kid growing up was him as an older man. And I think in recent years, I realized that there were actually photos of him as a young man. And so while doing the profile of him, I think I found maybe 2 or 3. But here it seems like they show him essentially through the years, which is quite interesting because it helps to humanize these figures from back then. I did a profile of Harriet Tubman and I was quite surprised. I'd seen a photo of her as a very old woman. I think she was sitting in a chair or a wheelchair, something along those lines. But I hadn't seen many photos of her as a young woman. And I don't think that they didn't feature anything in the documentary about it, but I do remember in putting together my profile about her, finding 1 or 2 photos of her as a young woman. I guess it kind of goes back to my misguided belief or lack of realization when I was younger that, older people that you meet in the world were young at some point. In living myself, I've come to realize that I knew when I was a little kid and got to be an older kid and then a teen and then an adult up to the present. And so obviously I was a child at some point. And so it's if I'm blessed to be old, in hearing about these people, especially because sometimes you see no photos of them at all, or if you do, it's just one person of them as an old person, that becomes like the mental image you have in your mind. My great-grandmother passed away a few years ago, and when I was born, she was already a senior citizen. But it wasn't until a few years ago when she passed away that my great-aunt, which is my grandmother's sister, posted a picture of her online as a younger woman. I would guess maybe in her 30s or 40s. And I was surprised. There was a time when this woman that I knew to be old didn't have gray hair. Years before that, we'd gathered at my grandmother's house after my uncle passed away, and she had this box with all of these photographs. And in between the photographs were pictures of my mom as a kid, very few of which I'd seen. I've pretty much seen pictures of her from maybe her late teens on up through the years. And I think I was maybe in high school when I saw a wedding picture from my grandmother and grandfather's wedding and realized that they were young too at some point in the past. And so here it was that she had this box with photographs of her as a young woman in her 20s or something like that. All my aunts, uncles, older cousins, my mom's first cousins who were also adults into their 20s or 30s when I was born. She had pictures of them as babies, preschool age children, school age children. And so it was interesting as I'd always been under the impression for my entire childhood subconsciously that these people, whatever age they were when I was born, that's pretty much how they looked from the beginning. They were born grown. With seeing these pictures of these icons from Black history, in particular photos that chart them through their lives, it really helps to humanize them. Right? You feel a greater connection with them because it's they lived, they went through life much as you did. Your experiences might have been different, but it's they started out as babies and developed much in the same way that we did. So it's it helps to foster a connection because it doesn't feel like this distant person that did these great things and was just born into that. Right? You see them progress along the years. There's been discussion of the Civil War era, right? People fighting the same war, but for different philosophical reasons. I've seen some of the photographs before. I think there's one with soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts. But here, there's a pretty extensive collection of photos of Black Union soldiers, right? So it can be argued what they were fighting for, but at least within this group, they were active participants in trying to achieve freedom for Black people. Seeing these multiple photographs of soldiers really helped to drive that home. By actively participating, they essentially freed themselves. So it's looking at the Civil War, you have these contrasting images. The reality of the Black soldiers versus the presentation of, the other fighters in the war. Here it is that you have this continuing into Reconstruction where you now have the formerly enslaved striving and progressing. And there's a series of photographs, portraits really, of the first Black congressmen. So this would be your Bruce K. Bruce's, people like that serving in Congress. Distinguished looking individuals. You know, they might not be in like hats and coats, but they're dressed rather nicely. They're well presented. And so you have those images of them. But then you have the emergence of really one of the first stereotypical films, right? Birth of a Nation. So you have the first Black congressmen, the portraits that they sat for, which present them as being very respectable, regular looking people, but nicely dressed. Right. So well attired for the time versus their portrayal in Birth of a Nation, where you have the soldiers and these early congressmen as being uncouth, shabbily dressed, having poor manners. It really shows you the importance of imagery, the telling of Black people's history through stereotypes versus reality, or even how Black people would portray themselves. We then move into the early 1900s, where you now have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, recognizing the power of image and harnessing on behalf of Black people as a whole, putting together collections of photographs to showcase Black people as achieving progress, striving for progress. As with the Civil War, so like you're now in the 1910s and 19s, Black people are going overseas to participate in World War I, and upon returning, you know, thinking that they might be able to further their rights as citizens or secure their rights as citizens, proudly wearing their uniforms, going to like photo studios to get their pictures taken, returning to America that in some ways was more hostile, as the service uniform was regarded as an affront to the Southern way. So now you sort of have like this wave of lynchings, much as you'd had in the years following Reconstruction. Once again, it's like ramping up. And with photography being more widely available, I would say in the years past, you now have photographic evidence of these lynchings, right? So, I've seen these kind of things in reading books about Black history and about lynchings. And something that's always struck me is the inhumanity of attending what's basically the public torture and murder of an individual, regardless of for whatever reason. And you have people just standing around in the crowd. It's like a social gathering where people gather, you know, travel from far to attend. It'd be like a picnic. People would bring their kids, family event, attending a luncheon, watching someone being tortured and murdered. And so in this case, now you have photographs of these events, photographs of these lynchings. Certainly not all, but a good amount of people standing around seemingly having a jolly good time. This while someone's hanging from a tree or some other structure, you know, or having been shot or burned. The people actually using the photographs, using the images to make keepsakes from these lynchings, right? Selling them as postcards. So throughout history, you have the use of photographs as like a means of recording a momentous occasion. And the death of a person certainly is. But here it is that they're taking and distributing photographs for entirely the wrong reason. Imagine if you've ever attended like a concert or something like that, some sporting event. Usually there's like, you know, people outside selling pictures, t-shirts, memorabilia and whatnot. Something that you could purchase to say that you were there. This is what they're selling with regards to lynching. So James Van Der Zee was a famed photographer who was based out of Harlem and took a lot of pictures during, I think it was the 1920s. Cool photographs. So it's like, you know, people are very nicely dressed, the men in suits, the women are in beautiful dresses. They look very dapper, very sharp. I'd seen different photographs of Marcus Garvey, and there's like this famous series of photographs that comes from one of the UNIA parades, where it's him in this carriage in what looks like military garb, and he has this hat with this big feather, and it looks incredibly regal, right, to see all of the people that are very nicely turned out. And so it's explained that Marcus Garvey hired Van Der Zee to take photographs of the UNIA. So it's like you have these different activists within Black history past a certain point where it's like they're now using photography and the image of Black people to present their idealized vision of Black people, obviously based on real people, but from their own views and initiatives. I'd seen some of the photos from the parade, but there are actually a lot more photos than I'd seen before. And so some of them are just regular members, but it was interesting that he wasn't the only one in this military garb, right? Like some of the other members were just equally sharply dressed. And so it just looks crazy, right? And so an interesting fun fact to learn is that this one individual that they hired, right? They hired this person and it wasn't just like random pictures. It was a strategy. There was a plan behind them to sort of show the world what a self-determined Black community could look like, could be like. And so here there's also some discussion of Black imagery and the conscious effort to exclude some people from family albums as a collective, right? So you have discussion of homosexual and transgender might not be the term, but individuals who dress outside of, let's say, the norm, outside of traditional clothing expected of the gender into which they were born. So there's some discussion on the part of crafting the manner in which Black people or perceived Black people are presented. And so you also have photographers speaking about their experience either being excluded because they don't fit, let's say, the traditional image of Black society, or members of Black society having themselves excluded from the family album. Not to say the photographs weren't taken of like lesbians or gay men or whatever, but rather that quite often within the family setting, their photos would be excluded, which is an issue in and of itself, as well as, you know, kind of shying away from sexuality. And when I say sexuality, I don't mean sex necessarily, but more so, it seems like pretty much anything outside of like the heterosexual display. Right? So you'll have pictures of couples, men and women together, but less likely within the family album, or at least within some people's family albums, to have pictures of same-sex couples, although they're around. That's something to be discussed as well, where at the same time that people are trying to craft these images of Black people as something aside from the stereotypes, so in a positive light, which isn't really what you're getting from the mainstream media, there's also this push to kind of toe the line and efforts to kind of put the best foot forward. Anything that individuals might deem as being questionable or outside the norm or might be perceived negatively would be hidden away. It's like a form of respectability politics. Obviously, these people exist, the members of our family like everyone else, but in trying to craft this picture of perfection or striving for good and positive things, having arguably homophobic views, basically sitting in judgment of these individuals' lifestyles, the decision is made to exclude them from photographs, right, from this visual history. They exist, but there's an effort made to not recording as part of these memories. They live their lives like everyone else, and regardless of whatever their sexual orientation or who they're attracted to, it's cool to see them represented here, even though they might have been excluded from their families, right? So in discussing the progression of the Black image, and along the way, there's discussion of Black photographers who are notable. So in the early years, there weren't a lot of Black photographers, but over time, you then start to have like male photographers. And then we get to the point where now like you have several, it's still a small number, but you at least have a few notable Black female photographers. And so, you know, with that, they start showing examples of their work. I don't think I'd seen photographs by a number of these people, and I only knew the name of like maybe one or two. I think one of the photographers I knew was J.P. Ball, and that was through learning about his granddaughter. And then, you know, I was aware of Gordon Parks, who was another photographer mentioned here, and probably the only person that I knew by both name and work. It's not a super long documentary, so there isn't an opportunity to dive deeply into each one of the photographers mentioned. But what I think is cool is that in giving you kind of like a brief overview of their style of photography, showing you samples of their work, it's like you can watch, and whatever stands out, whatever appeals to you, you can then look into further. So it's like, while I previously knew of Gordon Parks and did a Black History short about him, I knew his work. But looking at the work of some of the other photographers, as I was watching the documentary, I started Googling them, looking them up on my phone to kind of do a deeper dive later on, to more thoroughly look through their work, get a feel for their work, their style. Also just to learn about them as artists. So I think it's certainly a cool documentary to check out from that perspective. Learning about some of these other photographers is like, you know, like I like that photograph. I like this piece. I have a plan where in the future I'd like to collect Black photography. So photographs of Black musicians, athletes, notable pictures. So like the iconic Muhammad Ali, Sonny Liston pictures, other iconic pictures from Black pop culture. And I've really just developed an appreciation for just photography of Black people in everyday life as well through the ages. I'd imagine it might be difficult to maybe find pictures of enslaved Black people, let's say after slavery, during Reconstruction. But I have seen quite a bit of photographs, and I guess this is because photography has become more widespread. So you started having the emergence of more Black photographers from like the early 1900s. So I can't remember the book, but there's like this photograph of these young boys dressed up in like little suits and stuff, sitting on the front of a car in Chicago. Just photographs like that, things I've seen along the way that have kind of sparked my interest to collect that kind of photography. And so looking at this documentary and learning about these other photographers, seeing photographers seeing photographs that appealed to me, but I had no previous knowledge of, I thought it was really cool because it's like, it made me more aware that there's like a wide array of Black art out there. You know, if you go online, if you go to buy like art prints and things like that, or even go to museums, art galleries, you certainly have Black artists, but as with most other things, you sometimes have to go out and seek it out. Whereas with white artists, I feel like it's more readily available. And so it sparked an interest in me to further seek out more Black artists. Like, Black art is out there. It's just that you might have to do a little bit of digging. It might not be as prominently displayed because, unfortunately, if you go to a lot of museums, like your general museums, there's very little focus on Black art. There's very little focus on African art, but it's out there. You just have to go searching for it. You know, I'd like photography and images that feature people who look like me. So in looking at this, I realized that, you know, there's a far wider array of photography out there than what I was originally aware. And I think if you're watching the documentary just from an art and style perspective, you're very likely to find at least one artist whose style fits your taste. So for just that alone, it's a cool documentary. But then also in discussing the history of Black photography, both in front of and behind the camera, because there's also some discussion of photographers trying to make a way for themselves, right? Black photographers trying to make a way for themselves in other areas of life and unfortunately running into racism or limited expectations based on stereotypes. So it's also like very informative. As we move towards the civil rights movement, I think one of probably the most noteworthy, impactful, but also unfortunate images, timeless images, would be the black and white photo of Emmett Till laying in his casket. Usually when you have a funeral, it's an opportunity for people to say goodbye to someone that's passed away. And if that person is presentable, for lack of a better term, or not presentable, depending on, their appearance when they pass away, that typically determines whether or not you have an open casket. In most cases, if the person has suffered trauma to their face, head, body, or something like that, to the point where the mortician, can't, for lack of a better term, make them presentable, then typically the casket would be closed. But in this case, given the circumstances surrounding Emmett Till's death and how at the age of 14 years old he came to lie in his casket, his mother made the decision to allow photographers to take pictures of his casket to document and record everything surrounding his funeral, right? So the funeral itself, but then also him in the casket. And from that, you end up with this very unfortunate and iconic image of him laying in his casket with his face just completely disfigured, swollen from the injuries that he suffered while being tortured prior to his murder. You also have pictures of lynchings, right, where there were these public spectacles where an individual being tortured and murdered would be recorded in the image. And these images would be shared around, sometimes turned into memorabilia and keepsakes. And so you have the further harnessing the power of images, right? Especially with the rise of mass media, where Black people are not just taking control of their images through photographs. You now have it that this is sort of at like the beginning of the civil rights movement, right? This image can now be broadcast not just across the country via newspapers or via television, but also around the world. And so you further have Black people utilizing imagery, photographs, and now video, mass media to show not just moments from their lives, but the things they're enduring in America, the things they're having to deal with in the world. To get these images out there and show what's really going on in life. Whereas through history, you have this thing of the racist power structure, taking images of Black people and thereby portraying Black people as they see fit. Now you have Black people taking control of their image, being able to record the image, being able to record moments from their lives, the good and the bad. And it really drives home the documentary's point and the importance of Black people showing their lives, sharing their lives, documenting their lives from their perspective, rather than having other people document and capture images from their lives. It's discussed at some points in the documentary where if you have an image and an image is an image, does the photographer really matter? Does it matter who's taking the picture? And the reality is yes, because while the scene unfolding is the scene unfolding, the way the photographer sees it and chooses to convey and capture that image makes a tremendous impact on the story it tells. It can be heavily influenced by the person taking the picture, their intent, their interpretation, the message that they hope to convey. So it's like, look at the photographs of lynchings versus the photograph of Emmett Till, where in the photographs of lynchings, I would assume that these were white people taking the pictures. The scene itself, from my perspective, is horrendous because of what's taking place. But here it is that you have the way that it's set up, that it's framed, and the image it conveys typically is not a means of humanizing the person that's being murdered or the person that's being tortured. It's more so capturing the spectacle of the event. And I still find it disgusting, but this is how you get to people buying these images as postcards and souvenirs, versus with Emmett Till's, like the image of him in his casket where it's zoomed in on his face. It's a close-up on the devastation that has been committed against this young boy, the destruction that has been done to this young man's body. It's not zoomed out to focus on the crowd, but rather zoomed in on the face of this individual. It humanizes him because you then also have these pictures of him as a young boy in life, pictures of him sitting next to his mom with a big smile, both of them, him with a white shirt, nice tie, this big smile, and then you have that juxtaposed against this picture of him in death laying in his casket. The person taking the picture, their intent, what they're trying to convey, has a tremendous impact on what you see in the photograph. And so this conversation that's had throughout the documentary about not just the importance of Black people in front of the camera, but also behind the camera, it really drives home in that one example, right, with just the imagery of Emmett Till, the importance. We then move on to seeing images from like the emergence of like urban streetwear and whatnot. And this is one of my favorite eras from Black history. So, the 60s were definitely cool. The 70s clothes were not exactly my style, but I really like the fashion of the 80s and 90s, that coming of age regarding the 90s of being immersed in hip hop, that whole streetwear scene. And so with the 80s and 90s, it's like we have the streets being more prominently photographed, being more prominently featured in pop culture. And so I thought it was a bit surprising that there weren't a lot of images or discussion of the Black image from that period. But then again, I know quite a few of the images from that period, but maybe it might have been a matter of who was taking those photographs. And even that could be a possible discussion, because it's like, in the same vein that the earliest stereotypical photos were largely being taken by white people, or they featured Black people or individuals in blackface and other demeaning imagery. The documentary ended a little bit short, but I would have liked to see some discussion of more recent imagery of photographs and things like that. And so, as I mentioned, some of my favorite types of Black photography is that of Black musicians and entertainers. Like, I actually really like album covers. And not to get off on a tangent, but I think that's one of the drawbacks of the current era. In the past, when you would buy a CD or, even records like the 12-inch kind, it'd have an image on the cover. With CDs, they'd have booklets. So there'd be an image on the cover, right? This is the album cover, but you flip through the booklet and you might have like songwriting credits, lyrics and whatnot, but often there were additional images. And some of those album covers are actually quite iconic. I think it would have been interesting to see some discussion of that, but that's just my personal preference. But I think that for what is and what they put together here, it's a pretty good documentary, quite enjoyable, very informative, a lot of striking images, and it's an opportunity to learn about Black photographers. If there is one drawback, I would say, some points of the narration irked me. It's like this kind of very dramatic and stylized voiceover that I just did not enjoy. But aside from that, it's a minor complaint. I otherwise enjoyed the documentary and highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.